The Clemson Tigers are doing something incredibly risky. And usually when we think about risk, it's thinking about an action. But what if I told you that their inaction was what was more risky than anything they've done? I spoke with Jake Crain of Crain and Company about this, and I want you to hear his thoughts in just a moment. But first, what Dabo Swinney is refusing to do, in my opinion, is very dangerous. And it's one of the most interesting case studies that we'll ever see in college football. Now, let me give Dabo some credit. He is one of only 3 active coaches to win national championships. And obviously he's won multiple national championships. He knows how to build a team, and he knows how to get his team to end up winning it all. This is not a shot at Dabo video, but it is a very peculiar strategy by him that I want to explore and talk about and see how it relates to the rest of college football. And so I'll give Dabo his credit. He is a good coach, one of the best in college football. Even with Clemson coming back down to earth a little bit, everyone in the country would rank him in their top 10. But his refusal to use the portal is going to prove one of 2 things. Number one, it's either going to prove him absolutely right, and the fact that continuity and building a team the right way, as he would put it, means more than any kind of temporary success. Or he's going to be the poster child for failing to not use the tools that were given to him. In fact, before we go any further, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Do you think that he ends up being proven right? Or do you think not using the portal, not embracing a tool or a benefit to you is going to be his eventual downfall? Now, I lean towards number 2, but I want to hear your answers and not let me impact what you think. I want to talk to you more about my thoughts on this, but first, listen to what Jake Crain of Crain and Company had to say.
And I want to make sure, I've got a lot of respect for Dabo and what he's done at Clemson. You have, regardless if you're a Florida State fan, you're a South Carolina fan, you have to tip your hat and be able to show some respect and say, look, you did a good job. But man, we say this on Crain and Company all the time. If you're not evolving, you are dissolving. If you're not adapting, you are relapsing. I don't understand how you can sit there and pound your head into the wall, and it's insanity, right? It's not saying, again, not saying go build the whole team out of it. I'm not saying take all the religious relics out of the field house. I'm saying, hey, man, it may be good to stick your hand in the portal every now and then. You know, just like, hey, man, and Dabo did a great job building it up his way, the Boy Scout leader way. You know, we're not gonna try and make any mistakes or do anything illegal, even though everybody was paying everybody before NIL. I hate to tell you, Clemson fans, y'all were doing that too, and I know exactly how you were doing it. But Dabo, and not to be too long-winded with it, TJ, but he's got, I call it the grandmother's toaster rule. Okay, my grandmother, God bless her, she's the sweetest lady of all time. She has had the same toaster for the past 30 years, and she loves to cook. She loves to cook breakfast. That's her biggest thing. Big breakfast, man, like King Edward sized breakfast. Every morning we go over this. One of my favorite parts of going to see her. But she's had the same toaster, and it was reliable for a long time, but then all of a sudden it stopped working well every single time. It's hit or miss. Sometimes the toast is good. Sometimes the toast isn't good. And instead of saying, you know what, I've had this toaster for 30 years. It's run its course. It worked. We need to mix it up and go buy a new toaster. She won't go get the new toaster. Like at some point, Dabo,
This worked for a
brother,
while. Yeah.
go get the new toaster. It was great when it was working, right? But just because you had great ideas in the stock market and a nice algorithm in 2015 doesn't mean it's going to work in 2020, dog. Go get a new toaster, and you know what? You just might fall in love with it, Dabo, right? Feel dangerous, but also safe. I don't know.
When Jake and I were chatting just a couple of days ago, I had no clue that he would go there and come up with the toaster analogy, but I did like it, and I thought it was pretty relevant. You don't necessarily keep using the old toaster because it worked for you for years in the past. Sometimes you have to adapt. Nick Saban was the absolute best at adapting, and he would tell you before you'd put a rule into place, an RPO or NIL or the transfer portal, he'd tell you, don't do this because I'm going to learn it and do it better than you, and the haves will still be the haves, and the have-nots will still be the have-nots. And though we thought we were progressing and maybe moving past Saban, he continued to just get better and better and better at adapting to the changes. But Dabo is one that doesn't want to adapt, doesn't want to change his style, doesn't want to change the way that he's done things. And that's completely okay. That's why he gets paid millions and millions and millions of dollars to decide the best way that he wants to coach and build Clemson football. But I do have some concerns around it. Clemson today is not the Clemson they were 2, 3, 4 years ago. They have certainly regressed. And why is that? Well, you could probably look to a couple of reasons. Some of their coordinators have left. Some changes have happened at Clemson. They haven't hit at the quarterback position like they did with Boyd, Deshaun Watson, and then Trevor Lawrence. They've certainly regressed from that run that they had. And quarterback is the key that makes the engine go, I understand. But maybe they've regressed because they haven't been willing to supplement some of the positions that they've struggled at from the portal. Other teams in the ACC have used the portal to catch up to them. You look at Florida State, who was down just a couple of years ago and in a situation or position where it didn't look like they were ever coming back. And very quickly through the portal, they've risen back up to where now they are winning at a top 10 level, and they're also recruiting high school at a top 10 level again. You look at other teams. Miami has certainly caught up. They've done it a lot more through high school recruiting, but they've used the portal as well. You look at Cam Ward, who is arguably the best quarterback in the conference coming up this year, and certainly DJ Uiagalelei, who was at Clemson, then went to Oregon State, and now Florida State. Both of those quarterbacks would be ranked above where Klubnik would be for this upcoming year. And quarterback being the key that makes the engine go could prove vital for the Seminoles and Hurricanes to have better seasons than Clemson yet again. Other teams in the ACC have caught up, but it's also cost Dabo personally. It cost Dabo the chance at his potential dream job. The night that Nick Saban retired, there were fans of Alabama gathered around Saban's statue chanting, "We don't want Dabo." Whereas 2 or 3 years ago, he was a shoo-in for that job. He was the name that everyone said would end up on the sidelines in Tuscaloosa. He's the name that everyone said would end up coaching the Crimson Tide whenever it was that Saban exited stage left. However, he wasn't even considered. He wasn't even talked about or thought about as an option. Who were the names you heard? Lanning, Sarkisian, Norvell, and then obviously DeBoer. Clemson's Dabo Swinney was never even thought of, and I think it was due to his refusal to use the portal. I think Alabama knew the portal is going to be a big, big thing. We're going to lose a lot of guys with Saban stepping down. We're going to need to go to the portal. We're going to need to recruit it. And Dabo not being willing to do that, Dabo not being willing to replenish the talent that Alabama was about to hemorrhage, certainly turned them off, and they didn't even think about him. Whereas 2 or 3 years ago, he was the de facto head coach in waiting, if you can do that in another school. Clemson is certainly not looked at the same way that they were a few years ago, and that's what happens, right? You start to lose more games, and people don't necessarily look at you the same way they did before. I think they still think Clemson's a very good team. I think they still think Clemson has a chance to win the ACC this year. They'll probably be right there competing with Florida State and Miami and others in the Atlantic Coast Conference, but it's not Clemson and then everyone else in the ACC, and Clemson's really not even thought of as a top 10 team right now. They might be in that 15 to 20 range, but I don't think they're thought of in the same light as some other teams, even in the ACC, such as Florida State, Miami, and others. Clemson not being looked at the same way is one thing, but Clemson's also putting themselves at a very unfair disadvantage. You look at the biggest game they had this year, Florida State coming to town, an overtime contest against the Seminoles, and you look at the best players that Florida State had in that game, and what do you notice about them? That they were transfers. The guys that made the difference in that game were transfers. Keon Coleman caught the game-winning touchdown. Jared Verse was massive in that game. Keon Coleman caught another touchdown that got Florida State going early. And then, obviously, Jordan Travis being a transfer in that game as well was huge. Braden Fisk walked and escorted Kalen DeLoach into the promised land for the big fumble recovery touchdown. You had transfers all over the field, making massive, massive impacts for the Seminoles. If you would have taken Keon Coleman off of the Noles and put him on to Clemson, how much different would that game have played out? Well, you take 2 touchdowns away from Clemson. You give Clemson the best wide receiver option in the game. Do they end up winning that game in overtime? I'd figure to say so. Do you think if Dabo would have pursued Keon Coleman, that he could have maybe pulled him in? Who knows, right? But it's the refusal to even put yourself in the race. It's the refusal to even take a chance at it that is worrisome to me if I'm a Clemson fan. I've talked with many Clemson fans. I've talked with many people who follow and support and love Clemson. And I'll tell you, there is not a nicer group of people on the planet. Go to a game at Clemson. It is phenomenal. They're the nicest people. You can't even root against them. It's hard to cheer because they're the kindest, nicest people in the world. And Clemson fans respect the past. They respect what Dabo's done. They still love him. They're not over. It's not a fire Dabo situation, but they are frustrated with how he's not using the portal, how he's not giving them every advantage possible to go out and win. Alabama's taking that advantage. Ohio State's taking that advantage. Georgia's taking that advantage. LSU, Florida State, Texas, Ole Miss, Michigan, Notre Dame, all of your powers are doing it. Dabo is the one that says, I refuse to do this. And I think it's costing them. Again, it will be the most interesting case study that we've ever seen. Will it end up sinking him? I'm not sure. Will it end up proving him right? Will he be vindicated in a couple of years when they're back on top winning another national title? And he can stand up on the podium in front of all of us and say, I did it my way. He can play the Frank Sinatra song and say, I didn't have to use the portal at all, and I still did this. I don't know. We asked you to comment that. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. I think Dabo is a great coach. He has done a great job for years and years and years. But is this one thing going to be his eventual downfall? Hey, brand new channel. We've been at it for just over 2.5 weeks. Hit the subscribe button for more content just like this. Let us know what teams you want to hear from us on. What teams you want us to cover more. What teams you want us to talk about more. We obviously talk about conference realignment a lot. We talk a ton about the NCAA. But let me know what your thoughts are and what teams you want to hear from more on college football addiction.